Thank you very much for your kind introduction. My name is Shinya Maezaki, and I teach art history and design history at Kyoto Women's University. Before I begin my talk, I'd like to thank Printemps Asiatique and Edge Society France and all the people who have helped to put this event together. And I am thrilled also to talk in front of you today. And today I am supposed to be talking about Japanism. And this is not actually not my cup of tea, but I try to be my talk will be interesting. Japanism is a French term that refers to the popularity and influence of Japanese art and design among a number of Western European artists in the 19th century following the forced reopening of foreign trade with Japan in 1850s, as you all know. And when we talk about Japanism, often people show so many images like that, like, you know, the painting by Vincent van Gogh, Kunsan after Eisen. It's clearly showing that he was copying the idea from the much earlier Japanese prints by Keisei Eisen. And I don't really like this idea of showing so many images of and showing you that, you know, how similar it is and how different it is. So today I'd like to tackle this issue a little bit from a different point of view. And which is like, in order to understand what was happening in France in the late 19th century, I'd like you to know more about what was happening before 1850s in Japan. And probably many of you know that Japan took the isolationist foreign policy between the early 17th century to 1853. So Japan was basically closed to the rest of the world, and only the people who are allowed to be in Japan were some Chinese and Dutch East India Company. And so, while in 18th century and 19th century Japan, when not many foreigners were not in this country, what was Japanese doing was the first question that I'd like to talk about. Japan appeared to be a unified nation all the time because Japan is always Japan. It's because there is always an emperor living, mostly spending time in Kyoto. But during the Edo period, the de facto ruler of Japan was in Edo, present day of Tokyo, and their name was Tokugawa family. But Tokugawa family is not really ruling the entire country. There are actually more than 200 small states existed in this country, and there are laws or the kings, more than 200 kings living in Japan, and they don't like each other. So that's the idea of Japan in the 18th and 17th to 19th century. And after 200 years of reign by Tokugawa shogunate, the government had a financial troubles. So in the late 18th century, the chief counselor of shogun at the time, Matsudaira Sadanobu, introduced Kansei Reforms between 1787 to 1793. What he did is he introduced tight budget control. Soon after this reform was introduced, most of the 200 Japanese domains faced financial crises. That the problem is they don't really like each other, so they couldn't really help each other. So they have to find a new source of income, but they have to depend on themselves. So each domain tried to create or to develop their original goods. But good thing about Japan, by the way, is we have rich natural resources. We have plenty of water throughout the country, and the northern part of Japan is very cold, southern part of Japan is very hot, so the variety of plants could be grown on the island. For example, mulberry for paper, hemp, cotton, and natural dye for textile, bamboo for basket, urushi tree for lacquerware, and various hardwood trees for woodwork. And also, the country is on a volcanic island, so there are plenty of minerals could be harvested, such as gold, silver, copper, lead, zinc, etc. for metalwork, and kaolinite and feldspar for porcelain. So if you are a lord of one of these 200 domains, if you're lucky, you have a mountain full of gold or a mountain full of porcelain clay. But if you are not so lucky, you can still plant mulberry for paper or the cotton for the textiles. So this was happening between the 1800 and 1850, that the so many laws of Japan tried to create the new industry for themselves. And I would want you to see this for a little while. That this is the website that I created for the Google Arts and Culture Made in Japan project. I have worked on this for 6 years, for the last 6 years, and you can actually see many Japanese arts and crafts and how these pieces are made still today. But when, and actually I think I have researched more than 100 different types of Japanese handcraft objects still exist in Japan, and many of them actually began in between 1800 and 1850. And there are more than 1,000 handicraft objects still exist today, but I am sure that there are thousands of different kinds of arts and crafts created in between 1800 and 1850. That was a very important thing to understand the Japanism in France. It's because, Japan was actually waiting to be found the richness of the handicraft artworks in this country. So let's go back. And if you're interested, please look at the website. There are plenty of good images and, and pretty photographs. Okay, let's move on. So this is one of the very few examples, and all over Japan during that time, many new handicraft products was created. And among these, for example, Kutaniware, with the one on the left side, Kutaniware had, it appears that they had very long history. They originated in the early 17th century, but the kiln once stopped, and it reopened around 1800. And one of the new styles that introduced was the porcelain bowl, porcelain ware with a gold and red overglazed decoration. And this type of things was very new to the Kutaniware, but in 50 years' time, it became very popular to the foreign market. Or very famous Satsuma ware. Satsuma ware was also the same thing. The Satsuma domain was in the south of Kyushu Island, and they always had the ceramic industry. But when they started to create this white stoneware with polychrome decoration was around after 1800. So this was also the case that the domain, this was the very new product for the Japanese people. But so these kind of things was created between 1800 and 1850, and Japan was, as I said, they waited to be found by the foreign people. And then the day came in 1854 that the black ship arrived from the United States, and they forced us to open the port. Japanese government agreed, and after that, there are French people, Russians, and British, and many other European nations arrived in Japan and started trade with us. Only 2 years after the Japan opened the port, the Felix Bachmann, who was the French etcher, was said to be found the copy of Hokusai manga or Hokusai sketches. And it is quite surprising because, the transporting goods from Japan to Europe at the time was, very time-consuming process, because the ship has to go through the south of the African continent. But in 2 years' time, there are certain types of Japanese objects already arriving in France. And there's another example is the painting by James Tissot, painted in 1864, that the lady is wearing Japanese kimono. And I'm sure that this kimono was the actual thing that was imported from Japan. And it was quite surprising also that within 10 years that Japan opened the country, the fine kimono example like that was already arriving in France. But first time the Japanese, things Japanese was exhibited in front of the French people was 1867 Exposition Universelle in Paris. At the time, the Japanese government and also the Satsuma domain for Satsuma ware and the Saga domain for Arita ware was participated in the exposition independently. And the location of their pavilion is very interesting because they are surrounded with Chinese. There's a Chinese pavilion in the middle, and then this is the Japanese pavilion, and these are the other Japanese pavilions too. So, and I'm sure that I think that, and this is how the Japan was looked at the time, that China was in the middle and the Japan is the satellite nations around China. But anyway, one of the pavilion, the Satsuma domain built was this Japanese style building, and it became very, very popular among French people because there are three Japanese ladies wearing kimonos and sitting in the pavilion and being exhibited the way that the natives, how Japanese natives are living in the Japanese settings. And at on this exposition, that one of the first Satsuma ware, which later became very popular among European people, introduced. So this was actually very new also to Japanese people, this type of ceramic ware. But one of the first Japanism influenced work done by French people, by Felix Bachmann. In 1856, he found this Hokusai manga, and in 10 years' time, he was given the design, providing design for the Limoges factory. And he was taking the idea probably from the Hokusai manga. But to me, that's very interesting. He painted a flying fish and flying higher than butterfly, and behind and below it there's a cock painted. And to me, or the Japanese people's eye, fish means surplus, cock it means to be crowned, and butterfly means profit and longevity. So each of the images originally had a meaning in Japan, but when it arrived, of course, the meaning is lost, and probably Felix Bachmann chose these images purely for the visual beauty. So I think that's kind of the relationship between Japan and France during the time of Japanism is very fascinating, and really like that. And in 1868, another example by Manet, and he painted portrait of Émile Zola, and on the wall there's a prince of a small wrestler, and also you can see the Japanese folding screen. So these are the things that, arriving in France 15 years after Japan opened the country, and there are some of the fine and large examples of Japanese art already arriving. So it's also kind of surprising. And in 1868 is the year that Tokugawa shogunate, the warrior state, Tokugawa government decided to give up their headship of the family, and then the country was given to the Emperor Meiji. And surprisingly enough, the Emperor Meiji was at the time only 15 years old. So the first 5 years, Emperor Meiji and his retainers had very hard time to make the country stable. But after 5 years, Japanese government decided to participate in the international exposition in 1873 in Vienna. And surprisingly, again enough, that Japanese government spent half of the annual budget to participate in this exposition. Because, because Japan needed foreign currency in order to acquire foreign currency, because without foreign currency, they cannot buy a warship or the cannons and all sort of important things to compete against European nations. So they needed things to sell to the Europeans to get the foreign currency. And the only thing they had to impress the people outside of Japan was probably the ceramic wares and lacquer wares, and also the prints. But at the same time, they are not quite sure. They brought everything they had, and they asked to foreigners to tell them what is good, what interests them, and eventually they realize what is needed from Japan in Europe. And then, as I said, that these type of things are one of the things that sold well. Therefore, it was continued to be produced throughout the Meiji period in the late 19th century, but it was not chosen by Japanese. It was chosen by the foreign merchants or the foreign customers and Japanese people just responded to the demand and supplied what they wanted. So that's how these pieces arrived in Europe. The Japanese government saw that possibility, and so after the Vienna International Exposition, one of the Japanese delegation member, Matsuo Gisuke, was asked to establish the governmentally funded company called Kiryu Kosho Kaisha, and they are specialized in selling things Japanese to European countries. And their first branch was established in 1874 in Vienna, and then the next one was in New York, and later there was a branch in Paris as well. Now there are many Japanese objects that keep arriving in France, and for example, the potters like Theodore Deck was copying the design from the Japanese ceramic works. Or Monet made his wife to wear a Japanese no costume and pose it for him. And also on the walls, there are many fans that decorating on the wall, and they're all coming from Japan. So you can see that there's so many different kinds of Japanese objects arriving already in the 1870s. In the 1878 Exposition Universelle in Paris, also, of course, there are Japanese pavilions, and there are more Japanese things arriving in France. And soon later, one of the most important figure for the Japanism found Japan, or Japanese prince, who was Vincent van Gogh. And the three prints on your right used to be the Gogh's prints collection. So we are sure that he actually acquired real Japanese prints from Japanese merchants. And to me, I mean, what Gogh did for Japanese art was surprisingly big, because if he wasn't doing things like that, maybe Japanism might not have been regarded as big as it is now, because he did it, because he painted or copied painting by Keisei Eisen. And because he later became one of the main figure of Impressionists, that made Japanism worldwide and part of the history of Western art. I think that's the most important thing, most wonderful thing happened to Japanese art in the entire history of Japanese art. And there's other, of course, not only the painting, but the other artists produced works of art influenced by the Japanese objects. And this is some of the pieces by Émile Galley. These are the Japanese works, and if you put these two together, you become that. And to me, some of the Japanese people think that it's a stolen idea, but to me, I mean, just fun, and Japanese people wouldn't make this kind of thing. So I think it's very interesting. And then there are another, it's surprising, isn't it? Because the French people are having international expositions so many times, but Exposition Universelle in 1889 also introduced so many Japanese objects. However, after this exposition, decline began. Japanese, of course, in a good time, wouldn't last for so long. The Japanism started to decline in France, only in France. And this is an interesting chart that I created from the record, in Japanese side of the record. And in the 1880s, French is one of the major destination for Japanese ceramic ware. This chart is showing the sales destinations of Japanese export ceramic ware. And in the 1880s, France is one of the major destinations for Japanese ceramics. However, after 1890, it's clearly showing that French people lost interest in Japanese ceramics. Instead, especially in the USA, had so much interest in it. And this was, of course, if you read any books on Japanism, they talk about Japanism lost fashion in the mid 1890s. And actually the numbers are also showing that the Japanese in France was lost interest, lost popularity in the mid 1890s. And finally, 1900 Paris International Exposition, it was the beginning of Art Nouveau, and Art Nouveau was introduced to the world, and also it introduced the Japanism was ended in France. So that's the very long story put in a nutshell. But I would like to say a little bit more about that, especially this idea is would like to discuss with other speakers, that this image in the middle is the very famous book cover by Alfred Barr on the book called Cubism and Abstract Art. And because on the left-hand side, upper left-hand side corner, there is a Japanese prince printed on it, and Van Gogh printed on it. And because of that, Fauvism by Matisse was created. That's what the book is showing. However, I'd like to just introduce another fact, maybe not many people know about it, that in 1899, Japan joined the Berne Convention for the Protection of Literary and Artistic Works. This is the first copyright protected law, international copyright protected law. And in 1899, Japan joined it. And in 1900, Japan was told that Japanism is ended. And I think there's something to do with this international law, copyright law, but not many people talk about it. And I was wondering if there's anyone who knows anything about it. And after that, what happened to the Cubism and Abstract Art, that Near Eastern art was also introduced after 1900, and African sculpture also introduced to create the Cubism. But these two types of foreign artworks are not copyright protected at the time yet. So I was wondering, because I am an art historian, but I like things looking at in a different way of other people. And I'd like to know if there's anyone who knows anything about it. And after that, the Art Nouveau took over the Japanism. But to my eye, to Japanese people's eye, there are so many Japaneseness is still there. For example, the flowers that they chose for their ideas, for their works. And there's so many flowers indigenous to Japan, but they're not exactly copying things from Japan. They are absorbing the Japanese ideas, and they digest it. And they create something completely new. This is something that Japanese artists couldn't do at the time. So in a way that Japan still exists there, but Japanism maybe we couldn't call it Japanism. Oh, anyway. So that's all from me today. And thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnaud. I'll try to keep it short. So just a word that maybe the title in your culture Japan is almost the reverse of Bummei Kaikai. It's not the light, but maybe looking at another side of Japanese, maybe lesser, at least not as famous as the previous presentation showed, which are the most glorious, the most enlightened aspects of Japanism, one might say. Sorry, I have to figure out okay, and here we go. Sorry for when you think about occultism, of course, you think of the planets and the constellations. That's why, again, you will see that the time frame is just almost the same, 1880, 1900. So I could have started earlier and ended later, but I share the views of the previous speaker that Japan was in fact, I think, crossed the Atlantic at one point, and Japanism became something more international, and maybe a slight loss of interest in France. So I could say my talk can be summed up in 3 engravings or etchings by Felix Bachmann. So you have a mask of the demon, as in No in Japan, masque en bois. So that would be for the Japanese side. Then that would be for the Japanese side, which is Japanese baptism, which is strange. You see the owls, for example, that usually you don't see so much at baptisms in France. But and the third thing would be, of course, occultism, in the sense that Bachmann also engraved, etched also the frontispiece of a book called L'Ensorcelé par Barbé d'Aureilly, which is, of course, a novel in which you have a lot of local lore and legend in Cotentin, in Normandy, but also it has to do with the idea of the devil and of witchcraft, so, which would be the occult side of Japanism. More seriously, as my title suggests, my talk today, I evoked the, one more time. I mentioned the notion that Japanism and occultism, and I think what we have today is a notion that collecting practices and scholarly studies in Japan experienced a big change as the country opened. So far, it was mostly antiquarian knowledge, which means understanding the past through material culture, and very limited writing sources, because the export of books compared to objects was not, at that time, very easy from Japan. And scholars, and then you have, of course, with Japanism, the opening of the country, Japan as a vogue, I might say, as fashion, ryuko toshite no Nihon, where you see scholars, officials, art dealers, critics, I've given a few names here, forever changed the way that artistic Japan was promoted. And today, Japanism or Japanese is so obvious that you cannot see any art exhibition in Japan dealing with modern art where there's no connection with Japanism for right or wrong reasons. I would say, just to stay with the letter M, from Munch to Mumin, you see a connection with Japanism, and some prints or some works of art are quoted or are shown as influences or potential influences. More seriously, or I don't know if I should say seriously, but were there any real connections between occultism and Japanism? Second question today, why did gods, monsters, especially demons, Oni, occupy such an important role? The recurrence of demons and demonic creatures points out to the survival of early modern iconography, especially of some iconographic themes of popular paintings known as Otsue, images of Otsu. I refer you to the major publications my friend and colleague Christophe Marquet has written on the subject. I just mentioned one here. If you check, you'll find many other studies. So why the survival of this imagery? And is occultism a meaningful category to understand not only Japanese art, but Japanese religions, and possibly Japanese religions as they were described in the West? I start with, probably, if I was told Japanese, this would be my favorite work, The Lodge, by Merrick Satt at the National Gallery in London. So you see the fans, you see it's hyper-civilized, gorgeous colors. That would be one of the possible ideal images of Japanism. She was born in 1847, which moves me to the next slide. Another artist born in 1847, Kobayashi Ochika. Here is a fan with a demon. Demon is a twist on something that appeared in the paintings of Otsu, which is called Oni no Nembutsu. So this is a demon, probably it's been collecting alms and money from people. So you see two very different works for artists born in the same year. Until the opening of the country, I might say that Japan was literally an occult land in the sense of the Latin word. It was a hidden land. It was known mostly by, as I said previously, by thanks to the Dutch and traders living on a segregated artificial island of Deshima in Nagasaki. Up to 1850, you just have to look for the printings and also for the references. The most important book about Japanese history and civilization was History of Japan. History of Japan was a translation by Johann Caspar Schweitzer of manuscripts that are today in the Sloan collection in the British Library, and by Engelbert Kempfer. The book was never edited, fully edited, scholarly edited, but the scholarly edition in Japan is Ohotigus Japan today. But all studies of Japanese civilization by antiquaries, I just mentioned, and cabinet orientalists, to use again an expression, felicitous expression by Christophe Marquet, they follow the kind of Protestant secular Enlightenment pattern. I take the expression from Margaret Jacob. And Philipp Franz von Siebold might be considered the founding father of modern Japanese studies. And this is kind of, I would say, Aufklärung, Bunmei, at least Kaikai-inspired approach to Japan. Though secluded, the country needed to be studied not by emphasizing its otherness, not like the demon on the fan, but by shedding as much light as possible in its culture. Whereas in earlier Catholic sources, Iberian missionaries, Japan is a demon-haunted country, riddled with witchcraft and devil worshipping cults. Demons are everywhere and need to be exorcised away. The legacy of these two conceptions did not disappear with the opening of the country. Here's a very, I had to find an illustration that I wanted to talk about, but this is a very good way to understand the difference between the two. There is that form of vernacular religion. When I say vernacular religion, I mean typical not only to Japan, to certain areas of Japan, that's neither Buddhism nor Shinto, called as Shugendo, the way to achieve supernatural powers or powers to practice. So here's the definition you find in one of the most famous books printed by the Jesuits in Japan. The practitioners of that religion are known as Yamabushi, people who sleep in the mountain. And the French, of course, at that time, and Japanese would have been familiar with the translation, 1868 translation by Pagès, which says, certains hommes voués au culte du démon. Some people dedicate themselves to devil worship. Another Portuguese source says that these people are sorcerers, feiticeiros, who directly serve the devil, charlatans, cruel people. So that's one might say the interpretation, as I said, in missionary sources, whereas Kempfer describes them as hermits who abandon the temporal for the sake of the spiritual and the eternal, to exchange a commodious way of life for an austere and religious one, pleasure for mortifications, etc. So on one hand, you have a nuanced and well-informed image. On the other side, you think it's almost witchcraft and proto-Satanism. As I said, if we think, and the previous, of course, talk was about that, Japanese can be defined as the craze or the enthusiasm that swept Western countries after trade with Japan resumed in the 1850s, once the secluded country had been forced to open. Though we think of Japanese as a kind of prelude, I mean, to use a musical word, a prelude to the study, serious scholarly study of Japan, and of course to read a renewal in the arts. In many ways, the movement was not only an enlightened movement, it put emphasis on the radical otherness and an interest in the dark side of Japan. Or to quote Ernst Tessiger, I'm sorry I put it into quotation marks, but that's in The Bride of Frankenstein, A New World of Gods and Monsters. This interest among some Japanese for the dark side of Japan seems closer to Catholic missionaries' descriptions of the demon-haunted land around 1600 than to more sober interpretations. Just to get a quick fix on that, if you any search on any museum collection, from you can say the Victoria and Albert to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts to let's say Guimet Museum in Paris, you'll find a lot of objects from Japan, China, Korea, or others I might call mixed or Creole objects, because we don't know exactly where they come from sometimes. But it shows that you have a lot of representations of demons, monsters, ghosts, supernatural beings, strange gods. So I was supposed today to mention the Musée d'Ennery. Here you have a short description of the Musée d'Ennery. And she had been collecting since the 1850s, so that would be the early days, or even before Japanism, Japanese monsters, mostly chimeras. And now her collection has been studied in a landmark study by Elizabeth Emery. And I give you the reference here. And critical reappraisal is really necessary to try to understand why she collected those objects, provided we have any documentation to do that. But she was not someone who followed fashion. She was someone who created, in one way, a fashion that was quite unique. So people say that Japanism, Sophie Bash, in I would say another magnificent study of the Japanism, defines it as the whim of a jaded dilettante. But Clémence d'Ennery was hardly a dilettante, but her museum, her collections, which are private collections, inspired some acerbic, but at the same time interesting remarks by the Goncourt brothers. So here are some views of the museum. I also took some with my cell phone camera last time when I was there, but these are the ones you can find on the museum site and on the Guinea Museum site. See, this is, no one would think of this as typical Japanese or typical Chinese or typical whatever art. So that's, and this, of course, this charming and lovely orchestra, I think it was shown in 2018, at least it appears in the Gazette Drouot when there was that exhibit on Meiji art in France. Maybe some people know more than I do. So you see, this is not at all, again, typical Japanese art. You have that strange orchestra playing. But here are two quotes by the Goncourt, which I did not, I'm using Elizabeth Emery's translation, and I just added in italics some parts to untranslated. I'm not going to read it all, but the genius of Japan lies in its imagination of monsters. A world of demon animals, so you can see, the beasts of confusion and bastardy, Eastern apocalypses, dragons, chimeras, hippogriffs of opium. So you see, Japan seems to be a land of monsters. We've got to remember that the Goncourt were hardly religious people, so they were just describing, I think maybe, I don't think it was only a sneer, but they had seen D'Ennery's collections, and that's the way they commented about it. Here are some objects, of course, connected with demons, and also with the images of Otsu I mentioned before. So here you see a ghost, a female ghost rising from a gourd and terrifying a shamisen playing demon, you see with the horns. I think it's a fascinating object in itself. Maybe there are Tsuba collectors who can tell us more about it. Here's another version where you see a female ghost and animal-headed demons. So we go back to what the Goncourt said about the hybridation, the fact that the beasts of bastardy, I think that was their word. And you see the exquisite craft of the object. This I chose because I think it's very funny in the sense that the Goncourt are naturalists, and what is naturalism? It seems to indicate that this is of course in Japan much later, 1908, when naturalism took over Japanese literature. And so what are those two demons, naturalist demons, doing? They are, I don't know if it's a peep show or something. They're looking at a window to try to spy on a real scene, possibly. I don't know what they're looking at, but it's an interesting image. Back to today's talk, of course, one of the central figures, I called him a code hopper between occultism, Satanism, Japonism is Joris Karl Huysmans. That's a picture of him at his house. For people who are familiar with his work, it almost looks like a scene from down there, là-bas in French, when he's waiting for a potential lover in his apartment. I think this quote is the most interesting quote when you think about the Musée d'Ennery and beyond. Huysmans is a very interesting art critic, but at the same time, he mentions that what's really scary, what's really terrifying in Japanese art, and he mentions hokusai. So you can look, I think it's from the manga, but possibly not only. The Japanese are the only nation who try to procreate, to engender monsters. And in hokusai prints, you find women, terrifying women, looking like fairies hovering in the mists. I let you read the translation. Translation is mine. But they have the appearance of ghosts, or they materialize the apparition of specters. But they are not monsters. And then a comment on the chimeras and things that you have in the Dennery collections. I don't know if the description is connected, but I think it's a very interesting text that Elisabeth Emery does not mention in her study. Here's an interesting also thing to remember about Japanese. I'm sorry, it's very, Japanese happens like Wagnerism, you might say occultism, in a time when Japanism posits an opposition between materialism and spiritualism, the visible and the invisible, the hidden wisdom and secular knowledge. And of course, Huysmans, in that context, is a very important person, though I don't think there is any exhaustive study, as far as I could check from Japan, about the Japanese objects he owned himself. But of course, after that, he converted to Catholicism. He was convinced that people were Satanists, were trying to attack him, and he became a very different character. But he's one of those central figures that navigated between two worlds, the worlds of Japanese and the worlds of occultism. And here are possibly two sources of inspiration for the passage I've just mentioned. You see those female ghosts rising from the mist in the manga by Hokusai. See this. More interesting, or not more interesting, but maybe less known, someone who's not as well known as Huysmans, is Jules Bois. Jules Bois was a French journalist, a very prolific journalist, and as you can read, he published many books, starting with the strange religions, minority religions, basically religious groups in Paris, and then he moved to occultism and Satanism. He even teach Kabbalah and occultism at I think it's because Arnaud was introduced this way, but maybe like at the Institut Catholique or somewhere. And there is a chapter on his book on not le satanisme, la magie, Satanism and magic, but in Small Religions of Paris, there's a passage about a Buddhist ceremony, Gohoraku, which you still find today performed in Shingon monasteries, took place in Paris in January 1893. And in a very funny, you can find the text online, so it's very easy if you read French. Petite Religion Paris, you can find on the French National Library, I think, possibly on Wikisource, I'm not sure. It creates an opposition between Buddhism orthodox, which would be a real Buddhist like Léon Joseph de Millouet, which was the Guimet curator at that time, and eclectic Buddhism represented by Léon de Rosny. Here's the last paragraph. So you see the ceremony itself. Guimet Museum in 1893. So this is Felix Rigamet, and it's a famous drawing. Here you can see that he says, well, noble minds have been attracted by the doctrines of Siddhartha, being, of course, the Buddha. And I simmered, and as I reminisced the pious lunch I had with Antoine de la Rochefoucauld. And we mentioned Van Gogh, but in relation to Van Gogh, of course, he was one of the most famous collectors, who painted himself Mayas, Ieses, angels, and welcomed me at his place with the high priest Toki Horyu. So Antoine de la Rochefoucauld is really one of the strong, maybe the prominent figures in occultism, Hermetism, esotericism, Rosicrucianism. Anyway, all those forms of minor, you would say, occult fads that happened in Paris at that time. And he was also a major patron of the arts and a painter. He financed the Rose-Croix Salon, and he financed also the esoteric review Le Coeur. So that's the connection with Jules Bois. It would be interesting, and this I was not able to do for today, but to see what Japanese objects he had in his collection. So with the possible exception of Clémence Dennery, Japanese, despite their descriptions of monsters, chimeras, ghosts, demons, we don't know, but maybe they did not perceive that for some artists, contemporary Japanese artists, demons were laughing at modernity. They were laughing at the half-baked, trying to westernize Japan. So Kawanabe Kyosai, for example, was very well represented in French and American collections. I think there was recently an exhibition also at the British Museum. Again, I quote my colleague Christophe Marquet, the opening of Japan and the ensuing regime oriented his work in radically different directions, social and at times political caricature. He opted for radical critique and composed witty parodies at the beginnings of modernization. So he is one central artist, one of those late, one might say, artists that has been included, not so prominently, but that figures prominently on the reverse in collections in, I would say, all Western countries. And the same thing might be said about Netsuke. There's that fad, you don't have to have read Deval. There's that fad for Netsuke in Europe, which is certainly much stronger than it is or it was at that time in Japan. And if you look at Netsuke, demons and monsters are so, a wicked grin in the face of modernity. So I just picked one Kawanabe Kyosai picture, which is "Darkness is but a step away." Isun Saki Wayami, which means don't know where we're going. And there's a pun that's very hard to translate. Dig a pitfall, make two holes. But it's not inoraba, which means pray for. If you pray for someone, dig two holes. Usually it says noroaba. If you curse someone, you have to make two holes, which means, and then you'll be cursed yourself. And you have all things: the skeleton, you have the demon here, you have the woman who's going at 1 o'clock in the morning, like in Kanawa, the no place. So this is again a pun on the bestiary of imagination, to quote the Gonko brothers. And this is the last part of my talk. I would like to talk about Percival Lowell. Here's painting of him. I'm sorry, it's only in black and white, but it's the Harvard University Portrait Collection by Ercole Cartotto. And this is a modern painting, so maybe the name is not very familiar to some of you. So here's a brief biography of him. So I will just mention that he grew up in a very wealthy family, was very healthy, and he's almost a character straight out of Edith Wharton or Henry James. He attended Harvard. And his brother was also Abbott Lawrence Lowell, the president of Harvard University, and wrote his biography. He was a very successful businessman, trust funds, management companies, etc., stock market. And then he would go to Japan in 1883, quote, to study the language and the people. You have seen some of the people who travel with him, who are possibly some of the most famous names in the history of the discovery of Japanese art and of Japanism in the United States. And he also was one of the first Europeans to go to Korea as a photographer. So he's very well connected, a very interesting character. And he was one of the first Western travelers to go to the Noto Peninsula. And he wrote his most famous book, connected with the mountain religion I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, Shugendo. Occult Japan, or The Way of the Gods, an esoteric study of Japanese personality and possession. You can see that it was translated in a slightly different title in Japanese, Occult Japan, Ontake Aesthetics. Okay, let me see if I can move to the other slide. Don't know why. Okay, so he's not, I would not say he's famous as a character, but he's also famous for that discovery. He went there himself, and what he sees in Otake is that, the Japanese become possessed in turn. So someone is a toritsukareta, you would say in Japanese, possessed by one soul. Then they take turns. So the priest becomes the man who's possessed, and etc. So his book is a very interesting book. And here is a quote I took from the book. I could have taken many others. Of course, many of his views would appear as quite dated today, or out of fashion, or politically, somewhat maybe, but he never expresses really some unsavory remarks are made, but it's mostly in the spirit of his times. He was very much influenced by William James in his views on religion. After a decade, I had mentioned it in the previous slide, he left Japan, and in the fall of 1894, he started to supervise the construction of Flagstaff. Maybe some have been to Flagstaff, maybe some of you have been to Flagstaff. At that time, he did not visit the observatory, but and he published Mars and its canals, and Mars as the abode of life, and thus endeared himself to generations of amateur astronomers and legions of SF readers. So he watched those rites, demonic possessions, and rituals, which informed his interpretation of Japanese vernacular religions. He was the first Westerner to describe an occult religion that was neither Buddhism nor Shinto, but the quote-unquote mountain religion known as Shugendo. So that's the same religion described by the Catholic missionaries as devil worship, and that Kempfer had described with more accurate sobriety. His influence, though, was very important. It was very significant. Lowell was, he went out to observe Mars, but influenced one of the persons was interested in Japanese art, culture, and the art of the stage. One might say William Butler Yeats, one of the most famous Irish men of letters and poets, and William Butler Yeats. And he found in Lowell's book the work of a kindred spirit, and further confirmation that one of the key functions of no place is to exorcise ghosts obsessed by evil spirits. If you know no drama, in a way is one of the perfect examples. Yates remained obsessed with occultism, and of course, to some extent, with Japanese art for the rest of his life. He wrote a masterpiece called At the Hawk's Well in 1916, and I think that work is the best example of what I call the powers of transculturation inherent to Japanese. Maybe some of you, or I don't know, but attended Sugimoto Hiroshi's production of At the Hawk's Well, sorry for the displaying, at the Palais Garnier in the fall of 2019. And if you have seen this, you could say that it was not conjuring cheap tricks, but an invitation to explore other artistic mysteries yet unsolved. Here's a photograph of the premiere. It comes from the George Eastman Foundation, 1916, and it was, of course, a Japanese actor at that time. And this is what, of course, it became with Sugimoto Hiroshi, where you can see that Japanese, the spirit of a certain kind of Japanese is still living, very much living and very much alive today. And there you can see the traditional no drama, and at the same time something that's not exactly Japanese. It didn't end up. Lowell's connection with Ireland continued his Lafcadio Hearn, and was also inspired by Lowell, and in his books that were very famous and are starting to be reappraised, critically reappraised today, supernatural took a prominent place. But ghosts were for her a way to say that they are in some ways metaphors of Japanese. The yearning desire to apprehend and preserve the past, but also to interpret how natural environment define Japanese religion, East Asian religions, or how a spiritualist, shamanistic worldview encourage an appreciation of art based on intuition. Thanks to maybe the occult connections I mentioned today, collectors of Japanese art seem to have diversified their interests since the days of Japanism. And though as the collections of Seattle-based Mary and Cheney Coles show, the devils have not entirely disappeared. Scholars, amateurs, connoisseurs are still thinking with demons. Meanwhile, the happy few know that if you know where to look for them, the children of the night have not disappeared. There is an object entered recently, the collection that was of Matsumura Goshun, and only playing biwa, not shamisen. It's at the National Museum of Asian Art, formerly known as the Freer and Sackler Galleries in Washington, D.C. And to leave you with the last image, here's an image I took 1 week ago, or 10 days ago, when I sent to Arnaud the title of the tentative title for my talk today. And this is around Mount Iwaki in the northernmost part in the north of Japan, in the region known as Tsugaru, the Tsugaru Peninsula. And this is a temple where you can see a shrine, where you can see on the shrine side that the demons and an occult side of Japan has not entirely disappeared. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Francois. It was a wonderful talk and in perfect coherence also with what Shinya Maezaki also presented before on a different aspect of the influence of Japan in France and Europe. So it's a great pleasure to have listened to your presentation. Well, now that we are all together, I will do my best to put everyone there. Okay, and now we can start the discussion session between each other. I see that there are already some questions on the chat, so I will start there. But if anyone wants to react, and I would say that if Shinya in priority or François in priority, you would have some questions or discussion you would like to come back on each of your presentation, I would say now is the good time. I know. I think we have a question.
Yes.
Yes, Shinya. So there was a question by Jean-Michel. Maybe Jean-Michel, you can ask it directly.
Absolutely, no problem. I'll be happy to. Thank you for presentation. That was great. I've got a specific question for Shinya. You said that there was a lot of export from Japan to France, and that the taste was done. Was following the request from the Europeans and the French people and the collectors. What I wanted to know is whether if there was any impact on the Japanese taste from that, because did any of those pieces stay in Japan? Did that become something that the Japanese decided was interesting and wanted to use more? Or there was just purely for export and no impact whatsoever on Japan?
I think it depends which production site you look at. For example, I mean, Japanese people, for example, needed the cup and saucers to drink newly imported coffee. So, that type of thing stayed in Japan and become a part of the Japanese culture. But the most of the things that are produced for the European market are for the European market. And so and most of I think the makers sometimes couldn't understand why they are making that. And that was, continued from the early 17th century that, Dutch East India Company ordered Imari ware. But, they, for example, ordered teapot. But at the time, Japanese people never used the teapot for drinking tea. So I'm sure that the maker was wondering what this shape is for. But anyway, they made it and then transported it to, exported it to the European market. So I think that was the most of the case. And Japanese are not really influenced by the European taste. But the only places it could happen was the university, or like the schools in the Tokyo and Kyoto. They were supposed to learn what was the cutting edge design in Europe, because they are the ones who are asked to introduce the European ideas into Japan, but the citizens or the artisans who are not very educated, but they're just following the orders, they didn't really think about what they're making of. They're just creating the responding the order. I think that's what I think about your question.
Thank you. I actually have a follow-up question on that, if you don't mind. So we saw a lot of the influence from the arts and craft going to Europe with the collectors on people like Van Gogh and a lot of the artists. Did that ever also come back to Japan? Were they an artistic influence from those painters towards Japan eventually?
Well, that's also many ways to look at it. But the problem that we had about the painting such as Van Gogh is like it's oil painting, and then the Japanese people had struggled to learn and produce oil painting practices in Japan. First, they imported the Italian masters, but they failed. And then, Japanese people exported Japanese painters to France and then make them learn how to paint Western oil painting. And after they came back to Japan, we could say that, all these new ideas like the Impressionist, or after that, the Cubism and all sort of things are imported to Japan, and the Japanese oil painters, the Western style painters followed the idea. So in that way, in that sense, the French impact to Japanese oil painting was huge. However, when we talk about the export and import and the Japanism itself, there aren't so much going on, I think. And then as a volume of the things that are produced during that time in France, the stuff related to Japan wasn't so huge. It's one of the things that they might produce, but wasn't everything. And the Japanese people, especially people who saw the French market, often complains about the French people or the people in Europe often copies things Japanese, and they are partly proud of it, but at the same time they are sometimes very unhappy because they thought that it was the profit that they were supposed to make, but instead they are being copied, and then they are counterfeits and whatever, and so on and so forth. I think that was one of the reasons because Japanese government decided to sign the copyright agreement in 1899, and that was the bad move, I think, because you guys couldn't then started to continue, means that Japanese ended there. So it was very difficult to say, but I think this cultural exchanges often involved with not only the feelings, or they're always misunderstanding each other, especially Japan and France are so far away, and the Japanese artisans never been able to go to France and then how the Japanese stuff were used by the French people, but they are just told that you are popular. So they're so proud of it and made the same thing again and again. And the French people one time lost their interest. I think that's what happened. So it wasn't so close, and there are so much close connections between each other. That's what I think right now.
Thank you very much.
Please, Francois, go ahead.
I entirely agree. What might be a good thing to look at the same time is that for many book design, for example, Soseki, for example, Kaikoro, there's some early works, they were strongly influenced by people from the arts and crafts movement in Britain, but also by people you would qualify today as artists from the Decadence or pre-Raphaelites. So it worked both ways. I think many works by Japanese artists, but also by, we mentioned literature before, were influenced by the decadent movement in Europe. And as collection practices go, one of the influences that today is quite forgotten, especially in the French context, was Gabriele D'Annunzio, so the sulphurous, one might say, Italian writer, who was a major influence on some late Meiji, early Taisho writers. Or you could think also of illustrations for Japanese books, like Ningyo no Nageki, for example, by Tanizaki. So there was an influence also of the art and crafts movement, Mariano Fortuny, and then you would say later, maybe later on, pre-Raphaelite exhibitions, which explains maybe why today you would see more pre-Raphaelite exhibitions in Japan than in any other country in the world. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's quite...
Well, I was thinking another thing as well. When we're only looking at France and Japan, then maybe this discussion makes sense. But for Japanese exporters of Japanese things, Japanese goods, the French market wasn't so profitable in the 1890s, and they shifted the eyes towards America and also China. And then selling Japanese things to Chinese is much more profitable because, because we share the same idea. So whatever Japanese people uses, the Chinese people could use it. So it's easier to make the Japanese product more and then sell it to Chinese market. So, and then just making something for French people by learning how French people the taste and so on and so forth was so difficult for the industrialists. So they changed the idea and the focus changes during the 1890s and 1900s. And that is one of another reason that Japanism started to fade, because Japanese people are not there for French people anymore. So that's another reason, I think.
François, go ahead. I have to react also. But go ahead.
I entirely agree with what Maezaki Sensei had said. Plus, the main venue for Japanese art after 1900 is possibly before that is definitely the United States. And if we look at the collectors who went there, or in terms of fortune, I just mentioned Lowell, who's not a collector himself, but Bigelow, all these people went there. It's the Gilded Age in America. I mean, these are the people, as I said, straight out of Henry James. They are fortunes that cannot be compared even to French industrialists, even people as prominent as Guimet. I mean, the amount of money moving and the capacity to buy Japanese art, though, of course, Britain, France, I would say Scandinavia, Germany, even Russia were actors. They were minor actors after a point compared to what happened in the United States. And this is reflected today in I would say the collections and the richness you find in American collections. That's undeniable that at one point the Japanese became another movement. That's why maybe some scholars suggest to use it in the plural form, because there are as many Japanese as there are countries. It crossed the Atlantic definitely after a point.
But would you suggest that because obviously nothing is unconnected with geopolitical problematics also. When you come to the 1900s, there is also an expansion of Japan, as we know, in Taiwan and in Manchuria and Korea. And I was wondering if the change of taste on the French side, for example, and the interest with America is logical because there's a beginning of a political relationship between Japan and America regarding Russia's situation also. But regarding France, I was wondering if how did they, maybe the way they felt about the expansion of Japan had maybe a consequence also on taste and interest of Japan. It's a question I had in mind. I have no idea to answer it, but it came up in my mind. As we know that art and politics are difficult to separate, obviously.
Oh, I'm not specialist in it.
No. I was just wondering. François, would you have an idea?
It's hard. I think I was, unfortunately, I don't know if some people might blame me for mentioning that. Recently, we've seen many exhibitions in Japanese, of course, and Japanisms, as I said. Northern Europe would be a place to look for. Russia is certainly a place to look for. And in Russian collections, if you look also, there was a strong interest in Japanese art, and it's really the next door neighbor, because when you're
absolutely, yeah.
I was the other day just with a pair of binoculars. You can see you can see the islands off the coast, and you're not very far from Russia. Is really a close country. So I think the interest is also the markets, geopolitics. I don't know, but there was a strong interest, economical interest, and you've got to remember that many countries tried and failed to open trade before 1854 and the coup de force of Commodore Perry. But the trade was there, the opportunity was there, and a lot of countries took that opportunity.
Shinya, a question I wanted to ask you, because you did a plan at one time. You looked at the place of the Japanese pavilion in Paris. And you did explain indeed that there was a difficulty maybe to distinguish China to Japan, or China was in the center. I was wondering if in the other countries, such as in Austria or in Britain, for other expositions, it was the same way of displaying Japan next to China.
No, I don't think so. I think that was the first exposition. I can't really remember the other exhibitions, but that was, I think, the only maybe.
Oh, sorry, I'm going. No, it's okay. It's
okay.
Just,
I think that was the only exposition that I found that Japan was surrounding China. So at the time, maybe the French people thought that Japan is kind of part of China, but we don't know. I think that's the idea that I was getting from that.
But do we have the maps also of the pavilions in Vienna, for example, and Britain, and do we know exactly where they were located?
No, I think the main pavilion, I think they were separate, but the outside the pavilion was like put together. Because it is interesting that the image we get, the sketches of showing the Japanese flag, but the gate was always the Chinese gate, because Japanese flag was thrown behind the Chinese pavilion, but before many studies showing it, the Chinese gate as a Japanese pavilion, and I was trying to kind of say people it's wrong. Japanese pavilion is behind the Chinese pavilion and it's separate, but somehow it was being treated as it was the one thing. So
I see. Is there any questions from the people here, from everyone who would be willing to ask to our speakers? If I may, another question, maybe we'll bring also thoughts. I have two questions. One is for you, François. It's about a person who seems to be not very famous, but he is an engineer in France who's been working for Japan at the end of the 19th century for warships, and his name is Émile Bertin. I have no knowledge of anything. Is he a collector of himself? Because I know he has strong ties with the imperial family, and they kept exchanging after they came back to France after their work. But I was wondering if he was also someone of interest for the end of the 19th century.
Most certainly. And I think he was also, it's hard to say to what extent, but I think it's quite documented that he was also interested in collecting Japanese art. And but many people like that, and still something interesting today, that are the heirs or the descendants of the people who were in Japan during the Meiji era, or let's say from the 1868 and after. They left a lot of objects in their collection. I don't mean all objects were connected with Japan or China, but a lot of Chinese and Japanese art is still in private collections and needs to be investigated. And a lot of these people, like Emile, were their forefathers were people like Émile Bertrand, maybe their grandfather, great-grandfather, and they left big collections. That is really worthy of investigating. And that's the only answer I can make now. But I think if you look at in French collections, Émile Bertrand, you would find also many sources or available sources concerning Émile Bertrand. And I refer you to also the work of my colleague and Christophe Marquet, who's more knowledgeable than I am, specific, or Christian Pollack also would know a lot about these, French engineers and French people and the way they while they were in Japan, how they reacted to Japanese art, Japanese craft, or art and craft. So it's not Mingei, it was Mingei's sort of way, and that would be interesting interesting thing to look at.
A question online, thank you, François, for your answer, is as the Dutch were the only Europeans to trade with Japan, did they keep a privileged status in exchanges after the opening of Japan to the world? Shinya, François, you can both answer.
François started. François?
François.
No, it's I think, it ended in the 1860s, but they had a privilege. We've got to remember it was also one of the countries in the Treaty of Amity and Commerce. And before that, there was a special treaty for the Dutch that even in 1858, they were respected as a community. And I think, though, of course, the Netherlands at that time may not have been as prominent a country as France or Britain in many ways, the discovery of Japan in one way, and the promotion of Japan, promotion of Japanese art, which is another possible definition of Japanese, was mostly achieved by the Dutch. That's why I took the example of what I call the Protestant knowledge of Japan, or at least the Reform knowledge of Japan, or Enlightened knowledge of Japan. So definitely they played a prominent role before, and they did not vanish suddenly from Japan. A lot of works that we have after the opening of Japan are work written by Dutch people, or Dutch people writing in French, or in English from them. So they did not vanish suddenly from that.
And also, they are located in Nagasaki during the Edo period. And then in Nagasaki, there are Chinese people resided. So the Chinese and Dutch are doing the trade. But after the opening of the country, the first port was, of course, Nagasaki was opened, but the major port that was opened was in Yokohama. So the major, the trading companies from the British and Americans all resided in Yokohama. And later, in the first year of Meiji, the Kobe opened. So Kobe and Yokohama became the two major ports. And I think that the Dutch people was kind of behind to move their offices to these two major ports, and I think they are behind of doing some new trades with new industries in Japan, especially when the Kobe opened. Kobe is very important because it was surrounded by all the major, especially places like Osaka and Kyoto, where there are many good artisans resided, and all their stuff was actually exported from Kobe, not from Yokohama. So if you're looking at Kobe, and you actually know that what kind of things were actually exported to Europe, not looking at Yokohama. I think Kobe is more important. But that's the kind of things that many people have kind of overlooked and haven't really noticed. I think that's something. So these two major ports became major. Is probably something to do with the Dutch is started to fade among all the foreign nations traded with Japan.
So another question. Thank you both for your answer. These are very important questions indeed to answer and to look at. Edith Thierry is asking if there were Japanese dealers in France influencing collections of the statues of Yamanaka and Sons, for example.
Yes, Hayashi Tadamasa, Yamanaka Shokai, and the staffs of Yamanaka, the staffs of Hayashi, they are well, selling a lot probably for the French collectors, and not only French, but the collectors all over Europe.
In general, yeah.
In general, yeah.
I don't see other questions. If I may just ask one.
I see a question in the chat also.
You see another question?
From Eddie Terry also.
I've asked the question. That's it.
So there is another one, it seems. I mean, the one I'm seeing is not the one you asked. It's the Cubism influence. I mean, all the influence on Cubism. The chart from Alfred Barr. Mm-hmm. It shows the influence of Japanese prints. But actually, there was a lot of influence also of chinoiserie at about the same period. Do you have a feeling that there was a mix-up of, the two cultures amongst the collectors and the buyers in Europe? Because only Japanism appears here, but there was also chinoiserie influence.
Well, yes. And I think, this is Alfred Barr, how can I say, creating a book to support museum modern art. So I think there are some kind of manipulation of the history, because whatever they had in their collection, because it's privately owned museum and funded by the very rich three women, and whatever make them happy, I think he would have suggested, because at the time people not really understanding of what was happening towards the Cubism and Abstract Art. So this is one way of looking at it, but it wasn't the perfect way of looking at it, if there's anything like that. That's what my idea. So I'm not disregarding the chinoiserie or any other influences from any other cultures. But on my point of view, as being Japanese, we were so lucky that Alfred Barr chose Japanese prints on the upper left-hand side corner. Because of it, Japanese print became a part of the history of Europe, and also the ukiyo-e became a major category of Japanese art.
Good. We'll have a talk on China anyway. We'll discuss that also next week. So,
François, I think, wanted to react.
No, it's just, I entirely agree with Maezaki Sensei. Alfred Barr was trained as an art historian, and I think it's 1936. I need to check, but in my memory, the year before that, he did that exhibition on Van Gogh. So I think in his mind, it's well famous for that. I think in his mind, it was very clear what was chinoiserie and what was, Japanese art. I think the distinction was clear-cut in that, especially in the 1930s. So
I agree.
I think that the blur between chinoiserie and japoneserie might go. I think after the 1860s, basically, most people would be aware of the difference. Though being aware of the difference means educated people or collectors, you would say today influencers, because who were those people like Bing or people like the names we've mentioned? They were influencers. They created a taste for things Japanese. Of course, the average level of the collector, you'd say the bourgeois collector who buys an object. But I think in those days it was quite clear, especially in the days of Barr. I mean, the distinction was obvious. And of course, ukiyo-e is the, as you mentioned, the discovery doesn't go back to Alfred Barr, but the notion that the Japanese were connected with modern art. I don't think you see any comparable, or I would say commensurable example if you think about China in terms of the visual.
And also, I have another thing that when I had a friend who was over 19 years old 10 years ago, and she actually saw a great Japanese art exhibition in London in 1936 or 5, and she was an art historian at the time, and she told me that in 1936 nobody in London knew what Ming is or what Qing is. That was the first experience for many of the art historians in London to see the real Chinese object. And that was happening in 1930s. So before then, maybe because of the Japanism, Japan took a better place in the European art market. But that's what I think.
Jean-Michel, you wanted to ask a question, or was it?
Actually, because I'm one-side-minded, I would like to go back to my very first question, but in a different way. So clearly, there was no impact then in the 19th century about the manufacturing and the impact of the products exported to Europe and to France then. But now, do you see a trend of collectors from Japan looking at these coffee pot exported to France and coming back to Japan? Do you think that there is an interest there?
Well, Japanese people created Western style things in the Western style. But the problem about Japanese artists, artisans, for example, making teacup, they don't have the idea of the right size, because they are always making the teacup for Japanese tea. So they cannot go away from a Japanese teacup and making a new teacup of the real teacup from Britain in the size-wise or the shape-wise. So that was very difficult. So it was much easier for Japanese high-ranking officials to buy the real stuff. So they bought a lot they imported a lot from Europe. And then it was after maybe a Taisho period that Japanese started to catch up what was needed to be a proper tea set or proper dinner set, and able to create it. That was done by Morimura brothers, and then they actually traded with a lot to the Americans. But beforehand, buying the real stuff is much easier. And then some of the designers studied in Europe came back to Japan, and they taught the artisans what was needed in Europe. But when these artisans managed to create the real stuff, the taste of French people already changed. And so we couldn't sell it to Europe. So instead, we sold it to the Americans, because Americans kind of by 10 years behind, the taste is 10 years behind of French people, I was told. So, it was actually sold well in the Americans, but not the French people. So that was like, so we think about the time, and the people started to make the different things, and then the investment to the factories, and then it takes time, and it was very difficult for Japanese people to catch up to the speed that French people are seeking always the new things, and we were so behind of it. So there is always a problem between these connections, I think.
But my question was actually more related to the collectors of the 21st century. Mm-hmm. Now, there were kind of curiosity, because clearly the coffee pot was adapted to its use. So are people in the 21st century in Japan, and that applies also to collectors in Europe, I would say, looking back at that and making it a curiosity, something that is so unique that there is collectors for that?
Oh, yes, there is a collectors. It's difficult to find it, but there are very few collectors, because this is a problem about Japan, the Japanese education system, that we think that everything after Meiji is rubbish. That's what being told. So there aren't many collectors. Of course, there are many collectors collecting the Edo period object or older things, but the new things are not really coming to the market yet. So maybe in 50 years' time, it is going to be big. So now maybe the time to collect it.
François, you had something.
Yes, again, I agree, and they are collectors, definitely, of those. You would say what I might call in French, I'm sorry, but objets métis, Creole objects that were created for one market and drifting to another. But in fact, you've got to remember that one of the main, not rediscoveries, because it was known to Japanese scholars, it's not only ukiyo-e, jakuchu, it was the same. It's Etsuko and Joe Price. And then because he became famous in the United States, now he's become the most famous Japanese painter in the general public. So that kind of back and forth is going on. And those objects that were between the two, sometimes for some collectors, they're more interesting than what you would call the genuine, Japanese object. think about the Japanese collector, especially in those days when kawaii, is everything in Japan. Everything has to be kawaii. Remember the musicians I showed at the Denry Museum. They're not for sale, but if you sold something like that, it would not stay long at any art gallery in Japan. Everybody would like to buy something like that. So maybe that was designed for Western public or Western collectors, but the object itself would have many fans and many potential buyers today in Japan. The flux never stopped.
That's right. But the problem now we have is, I think, that Japanese people don't know much about the things made in the 19th and 20th century. So we are not educated, meaning that people are not spending so much money on it. That's the very different from Chinese case, because the Chinese people are spending so much money on Chinese art, but Japanese people are not spending at all money to the Japanese art. So the price of the Japanese art market is have gone down so much from the 20, 30 years ago, I think. So I think that's another problem that we are having at the same time at the moment. So I hope that many French people started to buy stuff Japanese and the price up. Otherwise, Japanese wouldn't buy it.
Well, you will have 28 people who will go and buy right now. Absolutely.
Good.
A question I wanted to ask you both, which is not exactly what you have talked about, but when we talk about Japanism and the influence of Japanese art in Europe, we talk generally of the period going until the Second World War maximum. But when we look at it, the influence of Japanese art on pop culture since the 1970s to today is huge. And there seem to be, and I'm thinking on more about exhibition problematics on this, is that we seem to have a focus only on the beginning of the 19th century, 20th century, and less interest goes for what happened, with TV, with manga, and all these kind of different kind of influence, which was of a magnitude incredible. So I want to have your advice on this, because we do see to have two dialogues of historians, art historians, and who talk about this period before the Second World War, and with a difficulty to attach with, I would say, a younger generation of people who are affected by the TV shows and series, which is also an influence of Japanese. It's not exactly the topic,
yes. When I was in London in the 2000s, I was at the British Museum working for Nicole Roumaniel and John Carpenter. At the time was my supervisor. Now he's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And there are, so I was seeing that how Japanese government was kind of looking at for example, pop culture or manga or, cosplay or as, how can I say, disgraceful. But, in 20 years afterwards, today, because French people love them, Japanese government thinks that was one of the new Japanese culture. So it takes time, and Japanese people needs to be educated, especially by French people, that, there are so many good stuff in Japan, but we cannot find them by ourselves. That's what I feel. Another reason why I thought is I'm going to show you that this is the works by Tanabechi Kunsai. I have been, how can I say, worked with him. I was kind of writing about concept of his works, and his works have been shown at the Musée Guimet or many other museums. And well, when he started working on this style of work, Japanese people never thought that it's wonderful. But the art dealer residing in Paris started to deal with it, and then he managed to make it shown in the major French museum, again, the Japanese government realized, oh, that's good. Then now the Japanese thinks that's wonderful. So, it's always this dialogue that we have that, it's not, I don't think it's good or bad, but it's just telling us how Japanese is. We are not, I don't know. Yes, François?
Thank you, Shinya. Absolutely, yeah. François?
Yeah, again, I agree. And it's true that 20, 30 years ago, but I would say it's not only the French, and I would definitely assume that it's not the French. I think in terms of contemporary art markets in Japan, when cool Japan, kawaii, like you mentioned, manga, but let's think about an artist like Nara Yoshitomo, for example, who's probably today the highest selling contemporary artist in Japan. He became famous in California and taught in California, and he was there with Murakami. Of course, Murakami got a kind of succès de scandale in France, but a lot of people don't come. I think Americans was a flexibility that was maybe not so as strong in the French, in some French art, rather conservative, approaches to Japanese art. In so many ways, I think the French somehow were interested in anime manga, so that's maybe I would slightly disagree with Maezaki Sensei on one point. I think that at first, of course, it was minor art. We might say that manga or anime or people like Nara today, they are widely accepted by Japanese authorities to promote Japanese culture, like Cool Japan. But
like Korea does it also very well. Yeah.
But in the beginning, they were completely rejected. And I think if you take anyone serious in the Meiji era, like though art history was in the Western sense was in the beginning, nobody would take ukiyo-e seriously. They would think, but because it's a gyaku-yu-nyu, it's the same as pizza was never popular in Italy. If you want to know, it was popular because Italians in the US started to eat that, Italians from the South, Napoli, and then it became like typical Italian food. And so that pizza coca, if you said in Japanese, gyaku-yu-nyu, you reverse the word. And that's the way the art market works. So some of these works were not, popular culture today is I talked about demons today, but Kimetsu no Yaiba, for example, the incredibly popular Japanese, manga, then anime, because it's also famous in the US and in France, it assumes a new status in Japan. Sometimes it even changes religious practices because of what happened in Western countries. So that's quite interesting.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your answers, Jean-Michel.
Okay. Well, thank you very, very much for the insights, François and Shinya, as well as to Arnaud for keeping the discussion dynamic and going, and everybody who asked questions too. That was really fascinating. I'm sure that everyone learned a lot of elements that they didn't know, that they will look at mutual influence between Japan and Europe from a very, very different perspective from now on. So thank you, everyone.